Alexandria. This is the legend. Sure. It's probably not true, but he took the 70 rabbis and had them lock them all in separate cells and had them translate the Pentateuch separately. And when they all came out and compared their texts were exactly literally identical. Yeah. And that proved that the translation was inspired by God. And so therefore the Greek translation was itself an inspired translation. So yeah, it's kind of like they're doing the same thing with the King James Bible.
Nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. Matter of fact, the Puritans, one Puritan wrote that he'd rather be rent in two by horses than to have that modern King James Bible thrust upon the church.
Oh, damn. Harsh.
Yeah, they were serious about that.
They used the Geneva Study Bible there, Geneva translation, yeah.
So let me ask you two, why is it, or how is it that both of you are very educated, both of you are well knowledgeable about these topics, but you end up coming to the grossly different conclusions based upon what you both evaluate as evidence, especially when it comes to the literal existence of Jesus? I mean, I can see there's textual issues where people can say, okay, these are salvational issues here, or this might not be correct here, or this passage might be even changed here. But we're talking about a fundamental thing in Christianity, as well as what you had brought up about the resurrection of Jesus and those things. But the existence itself, very fundamental. How is it that both of you have arrived at very different conclusions by reading the same types of evidence?
I guess I'll jump out at that first.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
It's interesting. I think it has to be in the world of presupposition, epistemology. I think it starts there. And I wanted to throw this out there. I have read one of Dr. Carrier's books, and that was the one that Why He Wasn't a Christian. Is that the title of that?
Dr. Carrier? Why I'm Not a Christian. Yeah,
Why I'm Not a Christian.
Yeah,
and
that's a nice, easy 90-page book. Yeah.
Yeah, I actually read that book in the midst of my own existential crisis of belief. And the reason why I did that is I wanted to make sure that my belief in God was not emotional. It wasn't just because I was raised in church. But I really wanted to deal with the hard issues. I had some significant questions about faith. I had started drinking again. This is about 3 years ago. And just wanted to say, hey, I was kind of mad at God over the issue of evil and suffering. And I read his book just to make sure that I didn't have any emotional reasons why I was believing or why I was hanging on to this. And so what was interesting, what saved my Christian faith was just the issue of apologetics and knowing, for certain, and I use that in quotes, of the existence of God and things like that, the general reliability of Scripture, the fact that Jesus did live. And I've just thought recently that, a lot of these things can be emotionally driven, experientially driven, why we would give up our beliefs in God. But I think a lot of it has to do with epistemology. And so I spend a lot of time in metaphysics and epistemology because I think it's really important where we're starting off at. Not as a presuppositionalist kind of looking at worldviews, but really, asking those questions of knowledge and how we know and where we're our starting base. And I know, Steve, I know you're a foundationalist, and so that's kind of where I start as well. So, yeah.
Somebody remembers an actual position that they got right for me. Awesome. Usually they're all over the place.
Yeah. I think that's true. Ahead. I think our foundations, our worldview foundations, are important in that regard. It does come down to epistemology and like you said, not really presuppositions. These are conclusions we've arrived at, but from other fields of study, other areas of contemplation. And in fact, so in the case of the historicity of Jesus, which is probably like a distraction issue, we could focus on like the resurrection of Jesus to be a more mainstream example. But I used to be a historicist. I was one of these guys telling people that these mythicists are crazy, that their arguments are stupid, and they don't know what they're talking about. It took me 6 years of like serious study, specifically on the subject, to really change my mind on that conclusively. And even that, my conclusion is it's more probably than not. I don't actually think I can be certain that Jesus didn't exist. I give him a 1 in 3 chance of having historically existed, which is actually a respectably high probability. It's just lower than most mainstream scholars would assign to it. But yeah, that took me a while. And so, and there's 2 factors there. One is I really focused on that issue really strongly and critically for a long time. And then the other is I didn't come at it with any need to believe any particular conclusion was true. Like it's no skin off my back if there was a mundane apocalyptic prophet named Jesus who got glorified later, or if he didn't exist. So both of those options. So I was able to like look at it without either lens. Like I could put on both lenses freely and it's not a challenge or a threat to my worldview. And so I think those 2 things together is what led me in a different direction than most people who've looked at this evidence. And the question I would have is so one of these key suppositions, and it's not a presupposition. I realize like you arrived at it through argument and reasoning, but you say, Kenny, reliability of Scripture. So that's an example of something that you're starting with that I'm not starting with. Why? What convinces you of the reliability of Scripture as distinct from any other ancient book, which you probably would not regard with the same trust, for example?
Well, of course, that the reliability of Scripture is certainly grounded upon the fact that God exists, and that the resurrection of Jesus Christ, the proposition God raised Jesus from the dead is certainly probable and reasonable if God exists. And if God doesn't exist, the proposition God raising Jesus from the dead is irrational. So it starts from a foundationalist argumentation toward the existence of God, and then looking for evidence in the world if this God has indeed showed signs that he has revealed himself. And so when we get to jump ahead to the reliability of the New Testament, the fact that they were written down within the generation of the first eyewitnesses, and they were written down in an Eastern oral community that had checks and balances, what Bailey terms a formal, controlled oral tradition. It seems just unfathomable to me that Jesus was a mythical person, and that Paul especially. I'm going to, cede some facts in the sense that I won't be appealing to those Pauline epistles that some say he didn't write, the pseudepigrapha. But I think if we just take 1 Corinthians, there's great evidence that he is talking about the fact he uses that technical language of receiving and passing on. And then, of course, you have, as Habermas speaks about, that triple OT clause, and that this has been dated back to within 2 to 5 years of the resurrection itself. So issues like that Pauline epistles are written down within 25 to 30 years of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you ask me about 30 years ago and ask me my first band in high school, I can do pretty good with remembering. And if I lived something out and was a disciple, like the early disciples, you better believe they remembered 30 years later. And of course, it was in a community that had those checks and balances. It's not like the telephone game that we all play. That would be what Bailey or Gurish Haston, I think is his name, what he termed informal, uncontrolled oral tradition. So that's, without sitting here and going off into a monologue about it. I think where you're a smart man. Yeah. I have a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who's an atheist, and I told him I'd be talking with you, and he goes, "Good luck." He didn't leave me with any confidence. Wow. He said, "Dr. Carrier's a genius," and so I said, "Well, I'm just I just going to talk person to person and have a cordial conversation and hopefully gain a friend throughout the situation, but just to discuss these issues. So
no, I much more enjoy the collegial discussions rather than the combative debating. Sometimes we have to do the combative debating, but these are nice too. I mean, you just listed a bunch of examples of more of these fundamental differences. So, for like the Gospels being written down within a generation or within the same generation, that I'm assuming you're dating the Gospels then pre-Jewish War.
John A.T. Robinson in redating the New Testament dates all of the. That's an example of a fringe position. Most mainstream scholars put the Gospels after the Jewish War, which would put them after any known eyewitness would have been alive. So, based on the average lifespans of the time. So I start there from the suppositions of the conclusions of mainstream scholarship, which date the Gospels a generation later. What do you call it mainstream? Just so I know what do you call it mainstream?
Everyone who's not a fundamentalist, and even in this case, even most fundamentalists. Right. So if you look at any standard reference,
Blomberg would not hold that view.
Well, that's an example of someone who's on the fringe of that. But if you look at, Erdman's Dictionary of the Bible, Oxford Dictionary of the Christian Church, New Interpreter's Bible, there's, pick any standard commentary, any major reference that's a standard peer-reviewed reference in the field, they're going to tell you this: the mainstream, the commonest view held by most scholars, both believers and non-believers, but especially all non-believers, puts the Gospels at after the Jewish War, with some exceptions. There are some scholars who try to date it earlier, although a lot of that, you can't really conclusively prove those earlier dates. They more just argue for the possibility of those earlier dates. But that's a difference. That changes how we look at this as to what the evidence is. Like if the Gospels were written themselves, if they were written within like a couple years of the supposed events, then I think that we'd have a good case for historicity. It's the fact that we can't.
What about the oral community they came from?
Well, that's another example. That's always just been a declaration. It's never actually been demonstrated that existed. The fact that you can have a community like that doesn't mean there was one. And I'll give you an example. We know, for instance, that the only example of that the Jews had was the Mishnah schools. So the Mishnah was transmitted orally, the Mishnah was supposedly the oral Torah. In legend, it was all the commandments Moses gave that he didn't write down, that he supposedly handed on orally. Probably didn't come from Moses, but whatever it was a collection of laws that had to be memorized orally, and they had schools. You would start as a kid at age 7 and spend like years and years and years memorizing the Mishnah, memorizing it, and then you would spend years in courts relying on it. So that's where you get this reliable tradition. You have an institution in place that's basically getting kids and drilling them on this. And then you have a community that's policing it, where we have evidence of this being the case. We don't have evidence of any such institution within Christianity at all. So we can't presuppose that there was one. And when we look at the Gospels, we see enormous variations in what version of the story is being told. So even there's not really reliability. And the Gospels are in Greek, so they're clearly not as is from the original community at all. Someone has translated these things into other languages. So this is, we're talking a foreign language in a foreign land, trying to represent stories that theoretically come from somewhere, but we can't even establish that those stories actually come from anywhere, as opposed to being literarily crafted. So that would be a different supposition where I'm starting from. And I have reasons why I reached that conclusion, but that's why you can see where just that is going to send us on radically different.
Now, where would you hold Papias as a existing individual who writes of the fact that he talked to the people that sat at the feet of the Gospels? And
he doesn't actually say that. Yeah, Papias doesn't actually.
John the Elder, yeah, he does. He talks about John the Elder. He talked to Philip's daughters. Church tradition holds that John lived into the 90s, and Papias talks about the fact that Matthew was written first in Hebrew.
Well, we know that's not true, though. Not our Matthew.
Well, how do we know that?
Our Matthew copies Mark verbatim and either adds to that or draws on the Q document, which we also know was in Greek. So Matthew's entire contents comes from Greek sources. Well, there's no Hebrew behind that. That's
kind of an assertion on your part. We've got a guy by the name of Papias who is living.
We actually
a third
have
generation Christian.
So are you a Matthean first? Do you think Matthew's first and then Mark is a redaction of Matthew?
I think all four of them are, for the most part, independent.
I see. So you don't think Matthew used Mark, that there was some other Greek source that's exactly identical to Mark that